Alright folks, today we're going to take a look at the third chapter of Brison's book, Aftermath, titled Outliving Oneself. In this chapter, Brison shows that a study of trauma shows the self to be relational. It's both autonomous and at the same time socially dependent, and it's vulnerable and at the same time resilient. So Brison explains that we all reason from a positioned perspective. This is not a new concept. We've seen this in a lot of the recent readings. In Elkoff's How is Epistemology Political, in Code's Taking Subjectivity into Account, in both of Lugonis's pieces, Playful World Traveling, as well as Purity, Impurity, and Separation. So reasoning from a particular position or positioned perspective, located perspective, sometimes having multiple consciousnesses, as Lugonis attested to, we reason from a variety of sometimes incompatible perspectives. So Brison explains or defines a traumatic event as an event in which one feels utterly helpless in the face of some force that is perceived to be life-threatening. And this traumatic event results in terror, loss of control, fear of annihilation, fear of death, hypervigilance, sleep disorders, depression, anxiety, inability to concentrate, and lack of interest. So what trauma does to a self, to a person, is it severs the connection between the self and the rest of humanity. And since victims of human-inflicted trauma are reduced to mere objects of another's agency or subjectivity, their subjectivity is rendered useless and viewed as worthless. So a traumatic event destroys one's belief that a person can be oneself in relation to others. And without this belief, one in fact cannot be oneself. Not even to oneself, because the self exists fundamentally in relation to others. And this should remind you of Beauvoir's account of recognition theory in terms of her gendered account of self and other. So on Brison's view, she's thinking about subjectivity and selfhood with respect to trauma, and she's showing that selfhood is necessarily dependent upon our relations with others. So to be a self, or to be autonomous, or to have agency, is not to be individualistic or isolated from others, but rather it's to have the capacity, the vulnerability to relate to others, to be oneself in relation to others. So without that connection to others, one can't even be oneself to oneself. So unlike traditional philosophical accounts of the self that take the self to be isolated, independent, feminist accounts of the self and other social accounts of the self consider the self to be formed in relation to others and sustained in a social context, because we are shaped by others and because our sense of self is embedded in social meanings. So without the social, without others, we could not be a self. Selfhood is necessarily social. The self is also necessarily embodied, on Brison's view. So traditionally, as we've discussed throughout the course, the body has been rejected in accounts of the self. And this rejection of the body has worked to objectify females and female bodies. So even Beauvoir has a kind of disdain for the body. Recall her solution was to transcend otherness, transcend our embodiedness, and become subjects, become rational subjects. And yet, there are other feminist liberatory accounts of the self, which include experiencing pregnancy and motherhood and other aspects of female embodiment. Yet, as was the case for Brison, the pleasures of embodiment, which one could experience by choosing pregnancy or choosing motherhood, perhaps not by being socially pressured into it, but by choosing it, are often replaced by the pain and the terror of trauma, whether it be sexual assault, rape, domestic violence. Women are highly, highly likely to experience some sort of physical and psychological trauma in their lifetime. And trauma induces a different kind of relationship with the body and with oneself. And Brison shows that traumatic memory is not merely narrative. That is, it's not merely psychological. It's an experience that reoccurs in the living body, having real physiological effects. So mental states themselves are not merely psychological, they're physiological. To have traumatic memories is not necessarily to have a kind of psychological or mental state. It's to have an embodied physical re-experiencing of the trauma. And so Brison gives this account to show that traumatic memory complicates the criteria of identity for selfhood, since typically in the philosophical literature on personal identity or on the self, the question has been framed in dichotomous terms, asking whether the self can be identified as a continuous body or whether the self can be identified by continuous memories. But because memories can be lodged in the body, this breaks apart the dichotomous framework of questions about the self being located either in the mind and the memories or in the body. So rather than ask questions like whether or not the soul survives physical death, the question becomes whether the self can reconstitute itself after being obliterated by human-induced traumas such as rape and domestic violence and sexual assault. And Brison explains that in the aftermath of trauma, survivors may change their bodies. They often change their bodies to enhance their control, their agency over themselves. So, for example, eating disorders are a common reaction to sexual abuse. The body and one's perception of the body are essential components of the self. The self is not merely a psychological modality. And feeling at home in the world is as much a physical as an epistemological accomplishment. And we can see this by investigating trauma, because after trauma, one loses trust in the world. One loses trust in others' capability to respect one's being and one's boundaries. In fact, many who suffer trauma often dissociate themselves from their bodies to defend against the annihilation of the self, although complete dissociation is never successful. Yet some survivors feel more connected to the body after trauma, and thus they feel more vulnerable after trauma. Regardless, survivors of trauma always experience the physical intrusions of visceral, embodied traumatic memories. Not only is the self embodied, the self is also narrative. So there being some unitary, isolated self is a fiction. It's an illusion. And again, this should remind you of Lugonis's account in Purity, Impurity, and Separation, of how the logics of purity construct this kind of fictional subject position that is outside of history, outside of the accidents of private history. This is completely a fictional and illusory subject position. Nobody can actually occupy this subject position. We are all vulnerable to the accidents of private history. And the trauma survivor has to work very hard to reconstruct the self in the sense of a kind of remembered and ongoing narrative about one's self, who one is, who one was, who one can be. So memories are lost, and basic cognitive and emotional capacities are radically altered by traumatic experiences. And so assumptions about the world become shattered, And they can be pieced back together, but it is a painful and difficult process. So by constructing a narrative of the trauma that the survivor endures, the traumatic episode can be integrated to gain control over the occurrence of intrusive memories, which, remember, are not controllable. They're not merely psychological or mental states, but they're embodied memories. Traumatic memories are embodied. We don't always have control over them. But one way to begin to regain control over oneself is to bear witness to those who can be trusted with one's experience, to give testimony to one's experience, to speak one's experience. Yet the residue of trauma is a kind of bodily memory. There are fleeting images, sounds, movements, all disconnected, whereas narrative or psychological memory can be controlled to a greater degree. There's also the influence of cultural memory, and she discusses the Holocaust here and how that affects not only Holocaust survivors, but children of Holocaust survivors. And this shows that the narrative self is deeply relational. And further, the reconstruction of coherent narratives allows one to gain one's voice and allows one to re-establish their subjectivity, their selfhood, with the help of empathic listeners to re-externalize the event. So bearing witness helps to re-establish the survivor's identity. Bearing witness is essential to the continuation of a self. The denials of listeners undermines the survival of the self. So not having people who will listen empathically to one's experiences, particularly following traumatic events, can undermine one's capability for subjectivity and selfhood. And in addition to being embodied and narrative, selves are also autonomous, although they're autonomous in a different way than we typically understand autonomy. That selves are autonomous is a very central view in philosophy. The self is the locus of autonomous agency, capable of making choices, willing actions, bearing responsibility for ethical behavior, and trauma undermines autonomy because the survivor's will is reconfigured. So many responses that were previously voluntary become involuntary due to the triggering of intrusive memories, traumatic memories, which involve different physiological responses, changes in cognitive and emotional functions. As Brison observed, if a rape victim is unable to go for a walk outside without fearing being raped again, she quickly loses the desire to go for a walk. So trauma undermines the capacity to choose and to act. That is, it undermines autonomous agency. And so if the self is identical with the will, that is, the autonomous agency, then a post-trauma self is not identical to a pre-trauma self. So when a survivor of trauma says, "I am no longer myself," what she's indicating is a loss of control over the self. Yet to recover, a survivor needs to be able to control herself and to control her environment, at least to some degree. And she needs to be able to reconnect to humanity, a connection which, recall, was severed during the trauma. And this control and reconnection depends upon other people. And Brison likens living with the memory of trauma to a kind of disability. In the same way that in disability studies, whether one can function depends largely on the social and physical environment, the built environment. Whether one can function with memory of trauma depends largely on one's social and physical environment. So autonomy is fundamentally dependent on others. It's not only compatible with socialization, but socialization and interaction with others are essential to autonomy. So autonomy is not a kind of isolated, independent agency. Rather, it's dependent on interaction with others. So the relational character of the self is also illuminated by the ways in which survivors are dependent on others' attitudes towards them in the aftermath of trauma. Victims of rape and torture report drastically altered senses of self-worth due to degrading treatment, which can be multiplied by past and continued group degradation. And it can also be furthered by the failure of others to listen to or to bear witness to the survivor's narrative of her experiences. So the silencing of victims of trauma perpetuates the trauma. In order to remake oneself, the goal of the survivor becomes to endure the trauma, not to transcend it, but to endure it. As one Holocaust survivor observed, whoever was tortured remains tortured. One lives with the paradox, I can't go on, but I must go on. And Brison optimistically observes that one hopes for a brighter future. One hopes for undiscovered pleasures. One remakes oneself by finding meaning in life, by caring for and being cared for and sustained by others. And so this connection with others is integral to the embodied, autonomous narrative self. Survivors of trauma then look for reasons not to have died, and they look to rebuild trust with the world.